Well, Kamala Harris also used her speech to lay out some of her foreign policy platform, including her support for Israel, concern about suffering in Gaza, and ongoing backing for Ukraine. Let's take a listen.
As Commander-in-Chief, I will ensure America always has the strongest, most lethal fighting force in the world. With respect to the war in Gaza, President Biden and I are working around the clock because now is the time to get a hostage deal and a ceasefire deal done. And let me be clear, I will always stand up for Israel's right to defend itself, and I will always ensure Israel has the ability to defend itself, because the people of Israel must never again face the horror that a terrorist organization called Hamas caused on October 7th. At the same time, what has happened in Gaza over the past 10 months is devastating. So many innocent lives lost. Desperate, hungry people fleeing for safety over and over again. The scale of suffering is heartbreaking. President Biden and I are working to end this war such that Israel is secure, the hostages are released, the suffering in Gaza ends, and the Palestinian people can realize their right to dignity, security, freedom, and self-determination. 5 days before Russia attacked Ukraine, I met with President Zelensky to warn him about Russia's plan to invade. I helped mobilize a global response, over 50 countries, to defend against Putin's aggression. And as president, I will stand strong with Ukraine and our NATO allies. I will never hesitate to take whatever action is necessary to defend our forces and our interests against Iran and Iran-backed terrorists. I will not cozy up to tyrants and dictators like Kim Jong-un who are rooting for Trump. And as president, I will never waver in defense of America's security and ideals, because in the enduring struggle between democracy and tyranny, I know where I stand, and I know where the United States belongs.
All right, let's get some analysis now on Kamala Harris's remarks. And for that, I'm joined in the studio by DW reporter Pablo Foley-Elias. Pablo, good to see you. Harris has actually been criticized, hasn't she, for not presenting a clear foreign policy platform. This criticism was heard both on the Democratic side and also by Republicans. Did she finally deliver enough details in last night's speech?
Depends who you ask. In many respects, a lot of what was said was nothing new. I mean, she touched on a lot of the topics. We saw it there in that montage of different sound bites from last night. One thing that really stood out for me is that she's going to continue to be a defender of the US's traditional allies and alliances. She promised continued support for NATO, which is very interesting. She's always been a big supporter of NATO, and also, interestingly too, continued support for Ukraine. And she said that the US will continue to stand strong with Ukraine. Let's not forget that she attended the Munich Security Conference, which she spoke about just a few days before actually the beginning of the war back in 2022. One thing that also she didn't shy away from was criticizing the former president and, of course, the Republican nominee, Donald Trump. She accused Donald Trump of aligning himself with autocrats and that he was a threat not only to the United States, but essentially to the world. Some very strong comments there. We heard it as well, in that she said that she was not going to cozy up to tyrants, to terrorists who are rooting for Donald Trump. Now, one thing also that Kamala Harris was criticized for particularly as vice president, was that she didn't have enough experience on the international stage. But we'll just give you a couple of facts here. She actually met 150 world leaders in this time that she's been vice president. She's visited over 20 countries. And also, finally, I'll finish by saying this. She made it very clear where the US under her presidency would be, which would be that we strengthen, not abdicate, our global leadership.
Mm-hmm. We also heard Harris refer to the war in Gaza. She spoke quite a bit about that. But just how different are her views compared to those of President Biden?
I think the big difference between Biden and Harris is that Kamala Harris isn't afraid to come out and, let's say, I'm not saying that Biden is afraid, but she has come out and been quite vocal in her criticism of Israel and some of its policies, particularly with regards to Gaza. She has been a long-time advocate for a two-state solution, and she's called for an end to the war in Gaza. My feeling is she will continue to be quite critical of Israel. She wants to see an end to the war in Gaza. And also, for those critics of the situation there, she did not reject we'll say, recent calls for an arms embargo. Sorry, she did reject calls for an arms embargo there in Israel. And also, she once again called for Palestinian self-determination. That was met with a lot of applause from the audience, but once again, she did support Israel. And she made it clear that she was trying to, I suppose, strike that balance, right? I don't know how this is going to go down with the voters. We'll see that in polling next week. But it was an attempt, at least, to kind of strike a balance.
DW's Pablo Foley Elias, many thanks indeed for all your insights. Well, European countries are also following the U.S. presidential race very closely. And for The View from Brussels, we're joined now by Terry Schultz. And also DW's Nina Haase is standing by for us in Berlin. Good to see both of you. Terry, I'd like to start with you. From what we heard during Kamala Harris's speech at the Democratic National Convention, what do you think her presidency would mean for fellow NATO partners?
Well, to be honest, I think that for NATO members, all except for perhaps Hungary, basically Kamala Harris would be a huge relief. And that would actually be true of almost any Republican candidate other than Donald Trump, because traditionally the Republican Party also has been very supportive of NATO. But of course, under current circumstances with Donald Trump as the GOP candidate, Kamala Harris will definitely be the preferred candidate in terms of NATO support. Now, we didn't see any reaction this morning from EU leaders, from NATO leaders, from national leaders. And that's not so surprising because, of course, it wasn't a speech that was heavy on foreign policy. But also you have to remember that they have to be very careful. Nobody knows who's going to win this contest. And Donald Trump, of course, will certainly target them if they come out speaking in favor of Kamala Harris. But I think that it was very key that she mentioned this statement made by Trump on the campaign trail that Vladimir Putin could do whatever he wanted to NATO allies who weren't paying 2% of their GDP on defense. That was a very chilling statement. No one will forget that. And I think that was a key message sent by Kamala Harris to members of NATO, that they would have her support. They wouldn't have to worry about such things with a Democratic presidency.
And Nina, what about Germany? Has there been a reaction to Kamala Harris's speech?
We had a reaction from the head of the so-called transatlantic bridge, that's Sigmar Gabriel from the Social Democrats. So the ruling party here in Berlin, he used to be the economy minister in a previous government. And he said that the most important message from Kamala Harris's speech was that she intends to continue working with her European allies very closely together. So this is, of course, the most important message that all the political parties who are still in the majority, who want closer transatlantic ties, will have felt a sense of relief to hear. But of course, that's also good news for German businesses. And it's also credible because she has done that in the past. She attended the Munich Security Conference regularly and publicly, has never left a doubt that she stands with the Europeans when it comes to Russia's war against Ukraine. And at the same time, I also have to add that here in Berlin, there is awareness that regardless of whether the Democrats or the Republicans are ultimately in the White House, if it weren't for Russia's war against Ukraine, the US would long have shifted its focus away from Europe and Germany towards the Indo-Pacific, where everyone agrees that that is the region that will be at the core of geopolitical power play in the 21st century.
Well, I'd like to speak a bit more about Ukraine. And Terry, as we know, even with all the support from Europe, Kyiv is still very dependent on arms supplies from the United States. So what would a Harris presidency mean for the war in Ukraine? Can Kyiv assume that they will continue to receive this kind of support from America?
Even if Kamala Harris wins the presidency, Ukraine can't be sure that U.S. aid will continue at the level it was before. And remember that it wasn't the White House holding up this $61 billion aid package earlier. It was Congress. And they may run into those troubles even in a Harris presidency. But one other note that I mentioned, or that I noticed in her speech that I think Ukraine would have liked to hear in this speech, a little bit more criticism of Vladimir Putin. When she mentioned that she would not be soft on autocrats, she mentioned the North Korean leader. I think Ukrainians and probably a lot of NATO members would have liked to hear her put Vladimir Putin in that list as well.
And Nina, what could happen if, let's say, we do see Trump return to the White House? Are leaders preparing for an impact on transatlantic ties if Harris does not win?
Well, you can't exaggerate the implications for transatlantic ties that the US election has. If Kamala Harris wins, there'll be small conflicts, yes, but smooth procedures in place. There are good and close-knit networks. They'll continue collaborating or arguing. But should Donald Trump get into office again, the pressure for Germany and for Europe to become more independent as far as security goes will rise significantly, and there will be chaos as far as communication also on the lower levels below the ministers is concerned. We know that from the previous Donald Trump presidency.
That was Nina Haase reporting for us from Berlin and Terry Schultz in Brussels. Thank you so much to both of you.